If today were the day of judgment, would you truly stand innocent? Not the kind of question people like to sit with for long. It slips into the mind quietly, almost like a whisper you try to ignore. Because deep down, most of us have already prepared an answer. I'm not that bad. I haven't done anything terrible. We measure ourselves against extremes, against betrayal, cruelty, violence. And as long as we fall short of those, we feel safe, untouched, justified. But what if that measure is flawed? Before we go any further, take a moment to follow this journey. Subscribe to the channel, stay with the story, because what unfolds here is not meant to accuse you, but to reveal something you may not have seen before. And once you see it, you may not be able to look away. The truth is, sin does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive in loud, undeniable actions. Sometimes it comes quietly, so quietly that you welcome it without resistance. It blends into your thoughts, hides inside your reasoning, disguises itself as something normal, even reasonable. And that is precisely what makes it dangerous. We tend to think of sin as something that begins with action. You do something wrong, therefore it becomes sin. If you don't act, you assume you are fine. But the deeper reality is far more unsettling. Sin rarely begins with what you do. It begins with what you think. A single thought, small, almost insignificant, can shift something inside you. A subtle comparison, a quiet dissatisfaction, a moment where you choose yourself over something greater without even realizing it. It does not feel like rebellion. It feels like nothing at all. And yet, that is where everything starts. Imagine a path that diverges by just a few degrees. At the beginning, the difference is invisible. You walk forward, confident, certain that you are on the right track. But as time passes, that small deviation grows, slowly, silently, until one day you realize you are far from where you were meant to be. That is how inner misalignment works. You don't become distant from truth in a single moment. You drift, through thoughts you entertain, through choices so small they barely register, through compromises that feel harmless because everyone else seems to make them too. And the most unsettling part is this: you can still look right on the outside while everything inside begins to fracture. There are people who appear disciplined, kind, even admirable. They say the right things, they act appropriately, they fulfill expectations. But beneath that surface, something else is happening, something no one sees, a quiet erosion, a slow reshaping of the heart. Because the real battlefield is not external, it is internal. Consider how easily a thought can justify itself. You tell yourself, I deserve this, or this isn't a big deal, or no one will notice. And with each justification, something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to move you slightly off center. And once that shift becomes familiar, it becomes normal. You begin to live with it. You adapt to it. Eventually, you stop questioning it altogether. What once felt wrong now feels acceptable. What once troubled you no longer even registers. And that is the point where the danger deepens, not because you are doing something worse, but because you have stopped recognizing it as wrong. This is why external appearances can be so misleading. You can build a life that looks stable, respectable, even good. You can follow rules, meet expectations, maintain an image that others admire, but none of that guarantees alignment within. Because alignment is not measured by what others see. It is measured by what you allow to take root inside you. A thought left unchecked becomes a belief. A belief repeated becomes a pattern. And a pattern, over time, becomes part of who you are. That is how distance is created, not in a single decision, but in a series of quiet permissions. And the most unsettling realization is this: You don't need to commit a visible wrongdoing to begin drifting away. You only need to accept a small distortion as truth. You only need to entertain a thought that places you slightly above what is right, or slightly indifferent to what matters. It is subtle, almost invisible, but it is powerful, because once the internal direction changes, everything that follows begins to align with that new course. Your actions eventually reflect it, your priorities adjust to it. Your perception of right and wrong slowly reshapes itself around it, and by the time it becomes visible, it has already been forming for a long time. So the question returns, but now it feels different. If today were the day of judgment, would you still be so certain? Not because of what you've done, but because of what has been forming inside you, quietly, consistently, over time. This is not meant to condemn you, it is meant to wake you, because awareness is the first interruption, the first moment where the drift can stop, the first point where you recognize that the path is not as straight as it seemed. And once you see that, you are no longer walking blindly. You begin to notice the thoughts you once ignored, the choices you once dismissed, the subtle shifts that once felt harmless. And in that awareness, something changes. Not instantly, not perfectly, but genuinely. Because the moment you begin to question the direction, you open the possibility of correction. And that is where the real journey begins, not in fear of being judged, but in the quiet, honest recognition of where you truly stand. Stay with this. Follow the next part. Because what comes after this is not just about seeing the problem, but understanding how it has been shaping you all along. Once you begin to see that the problem is not only in what you do, but in what quietly forms within you, a deeper question emerges. What exactly is shaping that inner direction? What are the forces, subtle, familiar, almost invisible, that slowly pull a person away without them realizing it? They are not loud, they do not arrive all at once, but they are consistent, and over time, they reshape everything. The first is pride. It did not begin on earth. It began long before, in a realm untouched by human weakness. There was a being created in brilliance, lacking nothing, power, beauty, position. And yet, a single thought entered. I can be like God. It was not an action, not at first. It was a comparison, a shift in perception, a quiet elevation of self. And that was enough. The fall of Lucifer was not caused by weakness, but by a belief in self-sufficiency, not a loud rebellion, but an internal conclusion. I do not need God. That same pattern still exists, but it rarely sounds dramatic. Today, it speaks in quieter phrases. I can handle this on my own. I know what's best for me. I don't need anyone's guidance. It hides behind confidence, independence, even success. And yet, at its core, it is the same movement, the displacement of something greater by the elevation of self. Pride does not always look like arrogance. Sometimes it looks like control, like the refusal to admit limitation, like the inability to surrender. And once it takes root, it creates distance, not instantly, but inevitably. From that distance, something else begins to take shape. Idolatry. Not the kind carved from stone, but the kind built in the heart. Because human beings are designed to center their lives around something. And when that center shifts, everything else follows. It could be money, the quiet belief that security comes from accumulation. It could be recognition, the need to be seen, affirmed, validated. It could even be technology, the constant pull of something that occupies your attention more than anything else. These things are not inherently wrong, but when they move into the central place, they begin to function as something more. A simple way to recognize it is this. What are you most afraid of losing? What occupies your thoughts when you wake up and lingers when you fall asleep? What defines your sense of worth? That is where your center lies. And when that center is misplaced, life begins to revolve around something that cannot truly sustain it. As the inner alignment continues to shift, another layer forms: hypocrisy. This one is particularly deceptive because it often looks right from the outside. The words are correct, the actions appear appropriate, the image is carefully maintained. But inside, there is a growing gap between what is shown and what is real. Over time, that gap widens. You begin to perform rather than live, to present rather than be. And the longer the performance continues, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before the mask. Eventually, the mask is no longer something you wear, it becomes something you believe. And that is the danger. Because when a person no longer recognizes their own inconsistency, they stop seeking alignment altogether. From there, the consequences extend beyond the individual. Indifference begins to take hold. Not active wrongdoing, but the absence of response. The moment when you see something that is clearly not right and choose to look away, not because you agree with it, but because it is inconvenient to engage with it. A quiet decision. It's not my problem. But every time that decision is made, something shifts internally. Because choosing not to act when action is possible is still a choice. And over time, that pattern builds a tolerance, not just for discomfort, but for injustice itself. It is easy to believe that wrongdoing only belongs to those who commit it directly. But the truth is more complex. Systems of harm are often sustained not only by action, but by silence. And silence, repeated often enough, becomes complicity. This leads to another burden that many carry without realizing its weight: unforgiveness. At first, it feels justified. You were hurt, wronged, treated unfairly, and holding on to that pain feels like a way of preserving justice, a way of not letting it go unnoticed. But what begins as protection slowly becomes confinement. Holding on to resentment is like holding a burning object in your hand, believing it will harm someone else. But the longer you hold it, the clearer it becomes. You are the one being burned. Unforgiveness does not freeze the past, it anchors you to it. And yet, there is a contradiction many live with: the desire to be forgiven, without the willingness to forgive, to receive grace while withholding it. And that imbalance creates tension, not externally, but within. As all these layers build, they lead into one of the most dangerous states, not because it is intense, but because it is empty. Spiritual apathy. This is not rejection, not opposition. It is something quieter, a gradual loss of sensitivity. What once mattered deeply becomes routine. What once stirred something inside now feels distant. Faith becomes habit. Prayer becomes obligation. Reflection becomes rare. There is no resistance, only absence. And that absence is dangerous because it feels normal. There is no conflict to alert you, no struggle to awaken you, just a steady drift into disengagement. You do not turn away deliberately, you simply stop turning toward. And over time, that direction defines everything. From that state, another shift occurs, one that seems small but reshapes perception entirely: ingratitude. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply forgets. Forgets what has been given. Forgets what has been sustained. Forgets how far one has come. It is not the absence of blessing, but the absence of awareness. And when awareness fades, expectation grows. What once felt like a gift begins to feel like something owed, something ordinary, something no longer worth noticing. That shift changes how you see everything, because gratitude anchors you in reality. It reminds you of dependence, of connection, of provision. Without it, everything becomes self-referenced, self-earned, self-contained. And that illusion reinforces everything that came before: pride, idolatry, distance. All of these threads, though distinct, are not separate. They converge. They lead to a final condition, the one that defines all the others. The absence of love, not the absence of emotion, but the absence of lived, active, intentional care for others. Because love, in its truest form, is not simply something you feel. It is something you choose, something you do. You can say the right things, follow the right patterns, avoid obvious wrongdoing. But if love is absent, if there is no willingness to forgive, to serve, to listen, to act for the good of another, then everything else loses its meaning. Because love is not one virtue among many. It is the foundation that gives all others their weight. Without it, discipline becomes empty, truth becomes harsh, faith becomes mechanical, and this is why it stands at the center, not as an additional expectation, but as the measure of everything else. So now, looking back across all of this, not as separate ideas, but as a single progression, the picture becomes clearer. It begins with a thought, a shift, a subtle elevation of self. It moves into misplaced centers, into appearances without alignment, into silence where action is needed, into burdens that are carried instead of released, into emptiness where there should be life, into forgetfulness where there should be awareness. And it culminates in the absence of love, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, consistently, quietly. Which brings you back to the question you encountered at the beginning. Not what have you done, but what has been forming within you? And more importantly, now that you see it, what will you do next? There comes a moment, quiet, almost easy to miss, when everything you've just seen could either weigh you down or wake you up. It is the turning point. Up until now, the journey has been unsettling. It has peeled back layers, exposed patterns, revealed how something as small as a thought can reshape an entire life. It has shown how easily a person can drift, without rebellion, without intention, just by allowing subtle misalignments to go unchecked. And if the story ended there, it would leave you in a place of tension, maybe even quiet fear. Because awareness without direction can feel like standing still in the middle of a storm. But this is where the direction shifts. Because the purpose of seeing clearly is not to condemn, it is to return. Hope does not come from pretending the problem isn't real. It comes from realizing that distance, no matter how far it has grown, is not permanent. That the same internal process that led you away can, with equal quietness, begin to lead you back. Not all at once, not perfectly, but genuinely. The return does not begin with strength. It begins with something far less impressive, but far more powerful: humility. Humility is often misunderstood. It is not thinking less of yourself, nor is it weakness. It is clarity. The moment you stop pretending that you are fully in control, the moment you acknowledge that you do not see everything as clearly as you thought, that your understanding has limits, that your strength has edges, it is the opposite of the voice that says, "I can handle everything on my own." Instead, it says, "Maybe I can't." And that shift changes everything. Because as long as you believe you are self-sufficient, there is no reason to reach beyond yourself, no reason to question your direction, no reason to open yourself to anything greater. But humility creates space. It breaks the illusion of control. It softens the need to always be right. It allows you to pause, not in defeat, but in honesty. And in that honesty, something begins to open. Not a collapse, but a doorway to truth. From there, the next step becomes possible, something deeper than awareness, more demanding than reflection. True repentance. Not the kind that passes quickly, not the kind that feels intense for a moment and disappears just as fast. Not the kind that says I was wrong, but continues unchanged. Real repentance is quieter, more grounded. It is the willingness to look directly at what has been forming inside you, without excuses, without shifting blame, without softening the reality. It is uncomfortable, because it requires you to stop explaining yourself and start confronting yourself. to recognize not just what happened, but how it happened, to trace the pattern back, not to a single mistake, but to the series of choices that allowed it to grow, and then to decide, not emotionally, but intentionally, to change direction. That decision may not feel dramatic. It may not come with certainty or confidence. In fact, it often begins small, so small it almost feels insignificant. A single choice made differently, a thought interrupted instead of entertained, a response softened instead of defended. But what gives it weight is not its size, it is its sincerity. Because real change does not come from pressure, it comes from alignment, from a decision that is repeated quietly, consistently, even when it is not easy. And over time, those decisions begin to reshape what was once drifting. But there is one more step, one that brings everything together, one that moves beyond internal correction into something outward, visible, lived. Love in action. Not the kind that exists only in words or intentions, but the kind that takes form in what you do. Because love, in its truest sense, is not dependent on how you feel in a given moment. It is a choice, a pattern, a direction you commit to again and again. It is choosing to forgive when holding on would feel more justified, choosing to listen when silence would be easier, choosing to help when indifference would cost you less. It is not always natural, it is not always comfortable, and it is rarely convenient, but it is real. Because love is not measured by intensity, it is measured by consistency. You may not always feel patient, but you choose patience. You may not always feel generous, but you choose generosity. You may not always feel understanding, but you choose to try anyway. And in those choices, something begins to shift again. This time not away, but toward alignment, toward connection, toward something that feels less like performance and more like truth. What makes this step so important is that it does not stay internal. It moves outward. It touches other people. It changes interactions. It creates impact, not through grand gestures, but through small, repeated acts that carry sincerity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it begins to rebuild what was once fragmented. So the path back is not hidden. It is not reserved for the perfect, nor is it blocked by how far you may have gone. It is simple, but not easy. It begins with humility, the willingness to admit that you are not the center of everything. It continues with true repentance, the courage to face what is real and choose differently. And it is lived out through love, the daily decision to act in a way that reflects something greater than yourself. This is not about becoming flawless. It is about becoming honest, not about erasing the past, but about redirecting the present. And perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: the turning point does not happen when everything is fixed. It happens when you decide to stop drifting. That decision, quiet, internal, unseen by others, is where everything begins to change. Not instantly, not completely, but truly. And once that decision is made, you are no longer moving away. You are on your way back. And now, after everything you've seen, after the questions, the quiet realizations, the patterns that may have felt uncomfortably familiar, the journey comes down to something far simpler than you might expect. A decision, not a dramatic one, not something the world will notice, but something internal, precise, and deeply personal. Because in the end, this was never about measuring how many times you've been wrong. It's easy to get caught there, to look back, to replay moments, to weigh mistakes as if they define the entire story, to wonder if the distance has become too great, or if the patterns have been repeated too often to truly change anything. But that is not where the weight of this story lies. What matters is not how far you've drifted. What matters is whether you are still willing to turn, right now, not in some distant future when everything feels clearer, not when it becomes easier, but here, in this moment where awareness has already begun to shift something inside you. Because every path, no matter how misaligned it has become, is defined by its current direction, not its past trajectory. You could have taken 100 steps away. You could have lived for years on a path that felt normal but slowly pulled you off course. And yet, a single decision, honest, intentional, real, can begin to change that direction. Not erase what has been, but redefine what comes next. And that decision does not require perfection. It does not require certainty. It requires willingness. The willingness to pause instead of rushing forward without reflection. The willingness to question thoughts that once felt automatic. The willingness to choose differently, even in small ways that no one else may ever notice. Because those small choices are not insignificant. They are foundational. They are where direction is formed. You do not become aligned all at once. You become aligned one decision at a time. One moment where you choose truth over comfort. One moment where you choose humility over control. One moment where you choose love over indifference. And then you do it again. That is how change becomes real, not as an idea, but as a pattern. So the question is no longer, have you been wrong? That has already been answered in one way or another. The real question is this: what will you choose now? Will you continue in the same direction simply because it is familiar, because it requires less effort, because it allows you to avoid confronting what you already sense is true? Or will you take the quieter, more difficult step, the one that leads you back, not all at once, but steadily? There is no audience here, no performance to maintain, no expectation to meet, except the one that now exists within you, the awareness that something can be different if you allow it to be. And perhaps that is the most important realization of all. You are not defined by the worst thing you've done. You are defined by what you choose to do next. Because every moment carries the possibility of redirection. Every decision, no matter how small, contributes to the person you are becoming. So do not measure your life only by what is behind you. Measure it by the direction you are willing to take from here. And if something in you has shifted, even slightly, then the journey has already begun. Not perfectly, but truthfully. And that is enough to take the next step.